I'm Heron, and I have a question for you. Has anyone even been as far as to do even though before want to do look more like? There comes a time in every person's life where I think we have to ask ourselves this very important question. Am I stupid? Well, today we're going to answer that question as well as a few other ones. This topic is going to take us through many different scientific, cultural, and other perspectives from linguistics to psychology to sociology to history and even neuroscience. As you may have figured out by now, with these videos, there's rarely a simple answer. So buckle up and let's get started. First, let's start in the realm of linguistics. The word stupid is derived from the Latin stupidus, which means struck senseless, amazed, or dull. So originally, stupid wasn't really meant to describe yourself. It was more a reaction to something, like you're being stunned by something strange that happened, like if you saw a cat walking on its hind legs. So it gradually over time began to take on this meaning of more mental slowness. The English language has created a bunch of different words to describe this concept of mental slowness, many of which I can't say in this video because they've over time taken on a derogatory use. For example, the word moron wasn't originally an insult. It was actually a clinical term used to describe somebody with an IQ between 51 and 70. We now simply classify that IQ range as below average. So language evolves and changes over time, and with it, so does the way that we think about intelligence. But speaking of IQ, what exactly is IQ? Well, in 1912, the German psychologist William Stern invented the first IQ test, IQ being short for intelligence quotient. The actual mathematical model to calculate our IQ has changed a bit since then, but the general idea is still the same, and that is we use a series of standardized tests to assess an individual person's intelligence compared to a group of their peers. So modern day IQ tests compares your scores to the scores of people within a similar age range. For this reason, the average IQ of every single age range is kept at 100. So rather than being an absolute number, it is a relative number. If you have an IQ of 100 and your grandfather has an IQ of 120, it could be that the two of you answered the questions the exact same way, but his score was higher because he was more intelligent compared to a group of his peers. So not only is IQ a relative number that does not exactly tell you how smart you are, but rather how smart you are compared to your peers, it's also widely debated whether IQ is a reasonable, good measurement of intelligence in the first place. So one of the most common criticisms of the IQ test is that because it was developed by a Western middle-class man, it sort of trends toward Western middle-class values. And it doesn't really account for things like creativity or social intelligence or even what we might call common sense. It's very focused on things like verbal and cognitive skills and problem solving. IQ tests are also not very good indicators of actual performance on a job. And this is important because we may think a specific job is very reliant on intelligence or on this specific type of intelligence, when in reality, a lot of other things go into making somebody good at that job. In 1983, developmental psychologist Howard Gardner proposed his famous theory of multiple intelligences, which pushed back against the over-reliance on IQ and suggested that rather than being one thing, intelligence had a very multifaceted nature. Gardner proposed different modalities for intelligence, which included things like language, logic, mathematics, but also spatial awareness and music and kinesthetic intelligence, interpersonal skills, and emotional intelligence as well. Gardner was also famous for suggesting that different students have different learning styles, meaning that teachers should try teaching a subject in multiple different ways, say through a visual presentation as well as reading the textbook, in order to help different students learn in different ways. Many educators still admire Gardner's work today and still use the theory of multiple intelligences. But personally, I like to think about multiple intelligences through a cultural or anthropological lens. Because just as IQ has been criticized for having a cultural bias, pretty much every type of intelligence that we can think of has a cultural bias in what we view as successful. So let's talk about one of my favorite topics, music. In the West, we haven't really changed the way that we write sheet music in hundreds of years. Western music breaks up sound into scales of 7 notes, and in between these notes are halftones or sharps and flats. All of Western music focuses on creating either harmony or dissonance through the use of these 7 notes and their equivalent sharps or flats. But in India, an octave is broken down into 12 different notes called swaras. These 12 notes can be further broken down into 22 intervals called shruti. These intervals are so small that in Western music we sometimes think of them as quarter tones, but that's not exactly true. They're definitely not precisely equivalent for multiple reasons. In traditional African music, song is intrinsically linked with dance. When you learn a song, you must also learn the accompanying dance moves that go with it. This can help put an emphasis on rhythm, and it trains your body to move in sync with the rhythm, which then makes the rhythm of the song more clear and stable. So if you were to go to India and study music, but you only knew Western notes and halftones, but you weren't familiar with these smaller, more intricate, more flexible notes, they might think you're a little stupid. If you were to go to Africa and study music and you didn't know how to dance, you might come across as a little slow. The things which you have learned to associate with musical intelligence in your own culture are not universally associated with musical intelligence in other cultures. I'd like to also take a moment to talk about the difference between being good at communicating and being intelligent, because you may have gotten through this much of the video and thought, okay, Heron, I get the point that you're making. You're very smart. You know a lot of things. But knowing individual facts and being able to write them down and communicate them clearly is not necessarily a sign of intelligence. I just sort of looked these things up on the internet and wrote them down, and now I'm speaking very slowly and clearly to try to help the words be communicated to you, the viewer. So even though it might be a good shortcut to sound intelligence, to look facts up online, write them down, and then speak them slowly into a camera, it's not really a great measurement of intelligence. is it? There's a famous quote which is often attributed to Albert Einstein, although there's really no evidence that he ever said this. Everyone is a genius, but if you judge a fish on its ability to climb a tree, it will go the rest of its life thinking it is stupid. Is it time for a personal anecdote yet? I have a good one. So, I've always thought that my family should be in some sort of experiment or trial about multiple intelligences because my parents are both in Mensa and they have no money sense whatsoever. My grandmother has the same IQ as Einstein, and I've watched her back her car up directly into a boulder. And I myself was told many times as a child that I was gifted, yet I do some of the dumbest things every day of my life. So, the first time I ever tried to buy a subway ticket, I was at a metro station in New York City with a friend of mine. And I walked right up to a machine that had a giant thing plastered across it that said no cash, took out a $20 bill and tried to shove it in the credit card slot. And I continued trying to get it to go into the slot for over a minute until a friend of mine walked over and said, "What are you doing?" I have so little sense of direction and navigation that I once got lost driving to my high school as a senior. I have walked into a restaurant and gotten so confused if it has more than one or two counters involved that rather than trying to figure it out, I just walked out the door and found another restaurant. One time somebody asked me for my phone number and I panicked and forgot it, and I gave them two different phone numbers smashed together. So when somebody asks me, "Are you stupid?" I usually just respond with, "Yeah, yes, yes, I am." And I'm aware that I can be very smart in some contexts and very stupid in others. But this self awareness doesn't always translate to empathy for other people when, say, I'm stuck behind somebody in traffic and they slam on their brakes for no clear reason. Then it's very easy for me to say, "Oh my God, why are you so stupid?" There's actually a name for this. I looked it up online. It's called actor observer bias, where when we make mistakes, it is very easy for us to believe that, well, I had an excuse. I had a reason for making this mistake. It's just a little brain fart. It happens to the best of us. But when somebody else makes a mistake, we don't know what's going on in their head, and it's easy for us to assume the worst. It's easy for us to think that person's just overall an idiot. I remember when I was a teenager, this was sort of early internet days. I used to see people making typos online and I would mock them ruthlessly. And I thought, if I'm a teenager and you're an adult, why can I spell better than you? Ha 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 ha, I'm smart, you're dumb. And I did that until I met another teenager and befriended him, and I learned that he had dyslexia. So he had a medical condition which made it very difficult for him to read and write. And because he was so used to jerks like me making fun of him on the internet, he was sort of fixated on spelling things correctly and ran things through a spell checker multiple times before responding even to personal text messages. So, this friend of mine was very smart and very gifted in many, many other ways, but he had a learning disability which caused him to struggle with words. And because of that, a lot of people frequently said to him, "Are you stupid?" This experience profoundly changed the way that I viewed intelligence because I'd never considered before, what if that person who I think might be stupid has a learning disability and is struggling to communicate? What if they don't even know that they have a disability and, like many people out there, have gone their entire life without a diagnosis, simply being told they're stupid? Another chilling question that occurred to me shortly after was, what if this person I've been making fun of never had access to the same educational opportunities that I did? What if they lived in a very rural community with poorer quality classes, with less educated teachers? What if they weren't allowed to go to school? What if they weren't able to go to school? What if English wasn't their first language? It is possible that the person I was making fun of for their spelling was trying to practice English as a second language by speaking with English speakers online. What if by making fun of their spelling, I discouraged somebody from learning the language and made them feel bad about themselves for no reason? So I think the takeaway that I would like you to have from this video is that intelligence is complex, and the things that we view as intelligence are not a single facet of one's personality, but they reflect a lot of differences between us, from ability to cultural norms to educational opportunities to physiological differences between our bodies. It can be very short-sighted to label another person as stupid unless you've lived inside their head, or even if you have. So, in conclusion, chat, am I stupid? Yes. And also sometimes no. And that's sort of the case for everyone, right? We all have little brain farts, we all have things that we're better at or worse at, and it's important to try not to be too judgmental, although it can be difficult in the moment when somebody is frustrating you. Anyway, I hope you learned something from this video. Maybe together we can get a little less dumber. Maybe. Alright, take care, y'all. Be safe. I'll see you in the next one. And has anyone really been far even as decided to use, even go, want to do, look more like? Am I stupid? And I have a question for you real quick. To do, look more like? Has anyone ever really been as far as decided to use, even go, do, want to do, look more like?